Hello and welcome to the Big Yearning podcast, released alternate Mondays at 5 p.m. UK time. We are two life coaches who really enjoy meaningful conversations about big questions. Our work and our lives have been shaped by these questions, and they've taken us to some amazing places in our lives and in ourselves. We all long for things, we all carry big yearnings in our hearts, and over the next hour or so, we hope to touch on some of these feelings and perhaps give you ideas or insights to help you get clearer about what you long for and how to get it. Hello everybody, welcome to episode 22 of the Big Yearning podcast. My name is Alexander and I'm the one who focuses on determination and focus and understanding, but I often forget to be present and enjoy what's actually going on around me.
And my name's Neil. I'm the one who's well into stillness, quietude, mindfulness, but sometimes really struggle to kind of step forward where I need to step forward in life.
Our topic for today is death and dying, an absolutely enormous topic, so we'll be diving into that in a moment. Today I just want to remind everyone that we really thrive on your engagement and your feedback and your questions. We absolutely love the fact that you keep showing up. If this is your first time joining us, then welcome on board. If you join us every time, then hello again. And if you want to get in touch with us, then hop onto social media. We've got a Facebook page and an Instagram account for The Big Yearning. We would love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear anything you'd like us to talk about. Please do send us questions. Would you like us to expand on something we've talked about before? Would you like us to talk about something completely new? We would love to hear from you. And if you just have any feedback about the way that the show is going, things you like, things that you'd like to hear more of, things you'd like to hear less of, we'd love to hear from you. So do get in touch with us. It always brings a smile to our face when we hear from one of you guys. So yeah, do feel free to reach out to us. We always begin the show with a quick check-in, and this is a thing that Neil and I do together regularly. It's just part of our lives. There have been parts in our lives where we lived physically near each other, and we would meet up every morning for a check-in and just to kind of drop into ourselves, work out what's actually real and going on for us under the surface, drop all the masks and pretenses, and just be present and real in the moment for a while and just witness one another through that process. It's amazing. I'm a big believer in the concept of check-ins generally, and we like to begin the podcast by doing that. It makes sure that we get anything personal out of the way first. It makes sure that Neil and I are present and here and we're with you, and it gives you guys a bit of a snapshot into what's going on in our lives. So we'd like to begin with our check-ins. Neil, would you like to check in?
Yes, thank you, Alexander. Yeah, I just want to echo what you said there in terms of the check-in is an opportunity to drop masks and show up as we really are. So I will do my best to show up as I really am right now. I'm really looking forward to the podcast. Right now, I'm really aware that it's spring, really aware that clocks have changed and the evenings are lighter, which is great. So able to get out more. And lo and behold, last weekend, I saw my first swallow of the season, which is always lovely for me. I was out walking with my partner. We do a regular walk around the lanes of Frome. And I saw this bird skim through the air. And I thought to myself, that's not a blue tip. That's not a pied wagtail. That's not a dunnock. That's a swallow. So by process of elimination, and my partner is a long-suffering partner of a birder. So she sort of like does a combination of a nod and a yawn. But nonetheless, it really makes my heart sing to just recognise these cyclical changes of the year. I find that it's something I can really rely on, paying attention to the changes in nature. For me is a real kind of comfort and reassurance. It's like whatever else is going on in the world, I know that the swallows and the swifts and the house martins are going to come. And then in the autumn, the redwings and the fieldfares are going to come. It's something I can kind of rely on, really. So that's a real joy for me. What else is going on for me? something that is really good at the moment for me is that I'm engaged in a coaching initiative offering coaching to teachers. My training organisation, Animas Coaching, has teamed up with a charity called Yes Futures, and they got together to offer coaching to teachers, so primary teachers, secondary teachers, and it's Yes Futures who are kind of leading it. Really, they're a charity who try to support the mental health and mental well-being of teachers in schools. So that's really lovely. It's really nice for me to be coaching some teachers. I have done some work in the past in my life in schools, so I feel I have a kind of empathy for what teachers go through day in, day out. And it was set up particularly to support teachers through this time of lockdown and the toing and froing between schools opening and schools closing. There's an awful lot of stressed teachers out there who, it's a kind of very stressful job anyway. My partner is a former teacher, so I know how kind of stressful the job is anyway at the best of times. So it feels really good for me to be putting something back into that sphere. And then the final thing I want to check in with is about the topic and the nature of this podcast. With each podcast topic, I really take time, I think both of us do, but I speak for myself. I really take time to contemplate the topic, think about it, do some research, but more so than do sort of hard research on things, I spend a lot of time thinking about things. And with this topic of death and dying, it just makes me reflect on issues around my own mortality, really. So I'm 54. I realise I may well have had more time on the planet than what I have remaining. That's in all likelihood. And so for me, I'm in a place and a space with this topic of kind of stepping back and having an appreciation of what has passed in my life. There's something for me around not wanting to get caught up in stuff that is petty or a waste of time. Not so much wanting to cram loads of stuff in, but more so wanting to savor things. So there's something maybe more about quality rather than quantity of stuff. And generally taking more time to appreciate things. So I'm really looking forward to the topic. I think, like you said, it's a really big topic, and it may be something that we come back to in future episodes. But we're just going to have a natter about it and see where our conversation takes us. And if there's something that emerges from that, then we will come back to it if that's something we feel is that we want to do and that listeners want. So that's my check-in. Over to you now, Alexander, for your check-in. How are you doing?
Yeah, broadly, I'm just doing really well. I'm really enjoying the arrival of spring. We've had a couple of unseasonably warm days here in Brighton. Some just evenings sitting down on the beach, watching the sunset, being really warm and just enjoying the waves lapping against the shore. It's been an early sample of summer, I think. I'm just really looking forward to that. Really, really love summers in Brighton and the heat and the easy access to the beach, and I have a view over the sea from my flat, which is an enormous gift, and I just love summers here. So an early sample of that, which has been great. And then looking forward to the end of the lockdown, but I think also just a kind of deeper reflection around the end of the lockdown and the immediate future, everything between the next sort of 6 months and the next few years. What's that going to look like for all of us? Just really beginning to take a step back and think, what is this decade going to be remembered for? When we look back on the 2020s, what kind of brand is it going to have? Is it going to be remembered as a time when we came out of lockdown, we'd survived the pandemic, and then we rebuilt and we returned back to our lives? Will it be thought of as quite a difficult and dark chapter in our lives? I'm really conscious of the big polarization right now between a group of people who have got richer through the lockdown, or at least been very comfortable because they've had a steady income, they've had fewer outgoings, they've been lonely, they've been highly isolated, and that's had quite a severe psychological impact, but they're okay. And then an awful lot of people who've lost their jobs, who have had to rack up huge amounts of debt in order to keep their businesses going. Whatever it's been that's impacted them, we now have a really big polarization between the haves and the have-nots, much more than we had before the pandemic. So just thinking about that, will there be efforts to rebalance that, or are we going into a chapter for our society where there is just this enormous polarization, a sort of re-emergence of the Victorian approach to things, where you have very rich people who are in control and very poor people who just have to try and keep up? Will there be a rebalancing? Will there be justice for everybody, or will we end up with one law for the rich and one law for the poor? Thinking about the impact that it's had on us psychologically, the isolation and the loneliness, it's now possible with technology that we could just stay locked away. Some of my closest friends who are really sociable people who just really thrive off groups have been saying to me, I don't really want to go outside again. I've been in this little room for the last year, under huge amounts of pressure to keep my job going, to look after my kids at the same time. I don't feel okay going back into groups, to be seeing people again, to be out in the world. Agoraphobia, social anxiety, it's a big thing. I've been meeting up with people, as we're now allowed to in the UK. I've started to meet up with people again. And even myself, I've been noticing a little bit awkward, a little bit not sure about things. We all sort of see each other and we're excited to see each other, but there's also how do we do this again? So that's going to be a thing. At the same time in Britain, we've got the effects of Brexit. We've got having a Tory government with an overwhelming majority. We've got a Murdoch-controlled media and the mass manipulation that causes. We've got the growing awareness of the impact of climate change and how that's going to affect us. We have new legislation in the UK which is designed to clamp down on climate protest. So what is this all going to mean as a whole? Are we looking at a period of instability and uncertainty? What will we, as a society, as groups, as communities, as individuals, reach for in this time in order to make us feel safe and have a sense of belonging and a sense of financial security, just safety in our lives? Every human being yearns for safety, and what are we going to reach out for to feel safe? And what will be the effects of that for us? This has all gone very big, and this doesn't sound like a check-in, but it is. This is really big for me. This is in my mind. This is in my heart. I'm really thinking about, where are we going together? What are we saying to future generations through our choices right now? So that's kind of my context. That's my backdrop. But alongside all of that, I really am excited by the return of spring. I really am excited about seeing my friends again for the first time in so long. There's been an enormous spike in my coaching. I've just had so many new coaching clients flooding in, and that's been wonderful. We've been talking about developing careers, dealing with death and massive shifts in life. I was talking last night to a client about her grandmother who is at the point of death and how that feels, what that means, what that brings up. Other clients working to understand lifelong patterns that have just dominated their lives, and then how do we put them to bed forever? How do we transcend that and move beyond it? How do you heal beyond those things? Amazing conversations. I adore what I do. So I've had a lot more of that. The sales of my book, Deep Joy, are beginning to pick up, and I'm about to do a big marketing push with that. On that note, slight step out of a check-in for a moment here. If you've read my book, if you own a copy of my book, if you've only just dipped into a copy of my book, I desperately need more reviews on Amazon. Please, please, please head straight to Amazon and leave a review. Even if it's just give it 5 stars and then say enjoyed in your comment, that would be fine. I need reviews on there because that will affect how successful the next stages of marketing are. So if you could help me out, that would be wonderful. Really appreciate that. And for those who have asked, my intermittent fasting is going well. Thank you. The last time we did a podcast, I was in my, I think, first or second day of it. So I'm a little way into it now. The initial effects were sort of a massive surge in energy and concentration. That's died down a bit as my system gets used to it. But yeah, I'm enjoying it. It's going well. I think I'm going to stick with it for a while, see what other effects it has on me, see whether it has, too many knock-on effects on what I can do in my day. But yeah, really enjoying it. So thank you for those who have reached out. I have learned that intermittent fasting is a little bit of a thing. It's a bit like joining CrossFit or being associated with a particular club or maybe even a religion. People just really identify with intermittent fasting. And everyone I've spoken to, I found myself doing it with my family. I'm going, oh guys, you need to get into this. It has all these secondary health benefits. It's really helpful for weight loss. It's great. and then reflecting on why did I do that. So yes, but it's going well. Thank you for those who have asked.
I can hear the evangelist in you.
Indeed, I think it does a little bit. Okay, so that's our check-ins, and I think there was stuff in both of our check-ins about death and dying and endings. So that kind of leads us smoothly into our topic for today. We are talking about death and dying today, and it is a massive topic. It was in response to a request from one of our listeners, and we've spent quite a while together and on our own just reflecting on all of the different aspects of this topic. It can be everything from the death of our loved ones and how that affects us. It can be how to support people who are at the end of their lives. It can be responses to our own mortality and the inevitability of our ending. It can be metaphorical deaths as part of our personal growth, letting go of things that no longer serve us and allowing the last chapters of our lives to die in a healthy and complete way. It can be the potential death of everything as a result of climate change. There is so much under this topic. These simple words of death and dying, they encompass so much. So, first of all, we're not going to cover everything today. Today, we're going to have a conversation. We're going to try and begin this topic. We're going to try and cover some ground, but we expect to return to this in the future. To begin us, Neil, I think you have a bit of a quote from a book for us.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Alexander. So, to set the scene with this, I'm going to read some words from a book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Francis Weller. Francis Weller is a Jungian-based psychologist and retreat leader working in the States. And this book is about 4 or 5 years old. And it's a fantastic book. I thoroughly recommend it. So this really sets the scene. So this is what he has to say in his introduction around death and dying. We live in a grief-phobic and death-denying society. Consequently, grief and death have been relegated to what psychologist Carl Jung called the shadow. The shadow is the repository of all the repressed and denied aspects of our lives. We send into shadow the parts of ourselves that we deem unacceptable to ourselves or to others, hoping to disown them. Doing this, we feel we may be spared the discomfort of having to face what has been declared unwelcome. Cultures also send aspects of psychic life into the shadow. Our refusal to acknowledge grief and death has twisted us into a culture riddled with death. In one of Jung's more chilling observations, or one of his more chilling observations, was that whatever we put into the shadow doesn't sit there passively waiting to be reclaimed and redeemed. It regresses and becomes more primitive. Consequently, death rattles through our streets daily, in school shootings, suicides, murders, overdoses, gang violence, or through the sanctioned sacrifice of the war dead. Needless to say, many of us limp through our lives carrying the scars of our death-dealing society. Unfortunately, the fingers of death extend far beyond the streets of our cities. Hillsides are stripped of trees, leaving homeless the countless others who once dwelled within the canopies, along the creek beds and the underbrush. Mountains are destroyed for coal or copper. Oceans are mined and emptied of fish. Creatures who dwell underground in direct conversation with the living earth through their teeth, claws and bellies are bulldozed away for moles and subdivisions. Death pervades our culture, becoming a presence we cannot contain or ultimately honour. We export our machinery of death to other lands through armadas of weapons, chemicals that poison watersheds, and in our support of tyrannical governments. Many more are caught in the rapacious appetites of corporate profiteers as they loot and plunder indigenous lands for oil and precious commodities, all with our tacit agreement and our denial intact. Now this, for me, is the really important bit at the end, just a few lines, what he says to finish off. Bringing grief and death out of the shadow is our spiritual responsibility and our sacred duty. By doing so, we may be able to feel our desire for life once again and remember who we are, where we belong, and what is sacred. So, yes, I think that really speaks for itself. There's a lot there. The last bit for me is really important about why a contemplation or a going towards death and dying and issues of mortality is important, fundamentally so that we can live more freely, more fruitfully, in a more alive way. So, Alexander, is there anything that you, in listening to that, anything come up for you that you would like to comment on?
An awful lot, Neil. I think that there was so much in that passage. Thank you for opening with that, by the way. For listeners, we hadn't shared that before, and I didn't know what was coming. And I think it was just a very powerful passage about the many aspects that we're talking about here. It reminds me of Derrick Jensen, who is an author and climate activist who writes very, very challenging and sort of in-your-face books about how broken and cruel and destructive our culture is. And he would very much say that our culture is predicated on death. We have a death culture. It is designed to kill. And both culturally and destroying the environment, and just everything we buy and everything that we do is predicated on death. And yet we live in this insulated bubble of obliviousness, of closing ourselves off from things, of everything being cozy and nice, and there not really being any consequences. And I think it's that cultural disconnect which is one of the core things that I guess I'd like to talk about today, which is, why is it that our lives are so safe and so comfortable and so death-free? Why do we live in this sort of eternal, optimistic, youthful ignorance, switching ourselves off from both our imminence of death, from the deaths of people around us, from the deaths that we cause through our actions? Why is all of that quietly parked, and so we're just allowed to get on with our lives in this inherently destructive culture? Why do we suppress this? And I think that shadow thing, I mean, maybe we could do an episode on shadow at some point, because it is just an amazing topic. But it is that. It's pushing it into the unacceptable, the disgusting, the unwelcome, and allowing ourselves to carry on as if it doesn't exist, but it's still there. And then every now and again, something will pop up and we'll just be dragged back into the reality of the moment and reminded that, nope, death is all around us and it's behind everything and it's going on all the time. So where do you think we dive into that, Neil?
I think for me, Alexander, one of the things I'm aware of with this topic is that for me personally, it would be very easy to get quite sort of theoretical and philosophical. And I think those aspects of this podcast are important. But I think for me in this instance, it's even more relevant to kind of ground it in kind of experience, really. And then for me, something will kind of come out of that. And as you were talking, there's really strong stuff, both in the Francis Weller quote and in what you say about the work of Derrick Jensen, someone who I'm very familiar with, and I really recommend his work. It's quite challenging reading his work, but it's very worthwhile kind of delving into. And I'm very interested in the flip side, if you like. So there's this lovely quote, for example, by the American essayist Terry Tempest Williams, and she says, "Grief dares us to love once more." So there's something for me about, in this podcast, we're talking about death and dying, but we're also, for me, talking about grief, about how we respond, how we react to to death and dying, to our mortality, to illness, to tragedy, to those kinds of things. And I'm really struck by this comment, grief dares us to love once more. And also Francis Weller himself says, it is grief that moves us in the direction of contact. So I'm going to start off to talk about an experience of death and bereavement that was most significant for me, to illustrate some points. So this is about the death of my mum. So my mum died about 10 years ago. And she went into hospital for what we all thought, me and my brother and sister and dad, would be sort of routine sort of convalescence, get her fed and hydrated a bit more, sort her out. She'd had a few falls. But lo and behold, after about 7 days in hospital, she died. And it was very unexpected. While at the same time, on reflection, I felt that Mum knew it was time to go. There was something I kind of felt within her spirit. It's like her spirit was saying, that's enough now. My time is done. She was kind of struggling with quite a few kind of physical impairments. And I just think that her spirit said, that's it. It's time to leave now. It's time to go. And the whole experience of my mum dying was a really important experience in my life, in terms of it actually bringing me closer to people, connecting me with people. So at the time my mum died, I felt myself to be really fortunate, because I was living and working at Embercombe in Devon at this environmental land-based project, which is very much it wasn't a conscious, intentional community, but it was almost a kind of community by default. And I lived and worked there for 18 months. And as me and Alexandra have often referenced, each day at Embercombe would begin with a check-in. We'd sit around a fire circle and we'd check in, we'd say how we are and stuff like that. And I felt so appreciative to be in that social context where I could show up in the morning, I could be tearful, I could fall apart, I could be vulnerable, and I could speak it out loud. And for me, that was one of the most precious gifts in my life ever. I'll always remember that. Some people have this phrase when they talk about relatives who have fought in wars. I remember a meditation teacher once sort of saying, she was speaking to her dad, and she said that her dad said, "I had a good war." And she sort of thought about that, and she thought, hang on, that's a bit of a strange thing to say. And when she questioned him more on it, he said, well, I had a lot of camaraderie, I was looked after, I knew that people had my back in situations of real adversity and fear, terror even. I knew that I wasn't alone. There was a kind of corralling round of people. And in the same way, I think in terms of my mum dying, I had a good bereavement. I had a good death. I was around people. I was able to connect. Also, I was able to, I quite consciously made sure that I followed the whole ritualistic process of mum dying and mum's death. So I went to see her body lying in rest, and I also spoke at the funeral, and something kind of intuitively moved me towards being involved in it in that way. So that was a really, really good experience for me. Also, some aspects of that experience speak to what Francis Weller has called this grief-phobic and death-denying element in our culture. So I remember really, really strongly, I was on a train travelling down from my home back to Embercombe, had 2 weeks off when my mum died, and I was just in tears. And actually to be crying felt really, really good. But at the same time, I was aware that I was in this public space of a train carriage, and I felt embarrassed and somewhat skittish about crying. It was okay if I turned my face towards the window, looking out of the train window so that people couldn't see. So I had a really good experience overall in terms of it bringing me closer to other people, closer to myself. I really engaged with questions around what's really important here, what really matters. And I found myself contacting friends that I hadn't spoken to for a number of years, and that was really good. But also this aspect of like, right, this isn't quite allowed. I feel quite embarrassed. I feel a bit silly. Is it okay to be crying? So yeah, so I'll leave that there. So for me, it's important to I feel like I can really speak to this topic if I speak from a place of experience, and hopefully for those people listening, things can be gleaned from that, or things might chime, things might not chime. It might be that I'm sure a lot of people, I've introduced this notion of a good death or a good bereavement. I'm sure that for many, many people, particularly at this time with COVID, there has been a lot of kind of really, bad deaths.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Neil. I think it was really beautifully put, and I'm really grateful that you feel okay sharing that with everybody.
It's a pleasure. It really is.
So I'm mindful of two things right now, I guess. One is this idea of a good death and the ceremony and the ritual around death and what it does for us psychologically, why it is so important to mark death in a significant way, in a solemn way, in a way that is really accepting the transition between this person is here and this person is gone forever. I remember a death which was very powerful for me was one of my closest friends, Roy. When I met Roy, he was 74. I've spoken about him before. He was the turbulent priest that I studied with in London. Very whimsical, in-your-face sort of guy who was also deeply caring. Spent a lot of his life caring for his parishioners and being with them when they were dying. So death was very close to him. And when I met him, he was a couple of years recovered from an enormous heart surgery. He'd had angina for years and had almost died. And he felt like he was living on borrowed time when I knew him. He became a very close friend of mine. We used to have conversations of very deep and profound kinds. And I was just very grateful to know him. I moved away to set up my cafe and therapy centre in Plymouth. And a short time after I moved away, I received the news that he'd died. And it was devastating for me. It was very upsetting. I sort of sat in my room staring off into space for a while. And then, because this is how I tend to process things, I wrote. And I wrote sort of a eulogy thing for him. And I put it on social media and it got a lot of response. And I was invited to come up to his funeral in London, I think a couple of weeks later. And I went up and the church was just bursting. I think I had to stand at the back because every seat and all the aisles were full of all these people he'd touched in his lifetime. And I arrived, I think I was a bit late, and I arrived sort of halfway through, and people were still giving sermons, and they were speaking about Roy, and then the priest stood up for the last section and said, and we'd like to close with the words of Alexander Butler, who wrote this on social media, and he read out the eulogy that I'd written. And it was a very deep moment for me. It was very weird to be. I think the community aspect of it. These weren't my people. I knew a few of them. We'd worked together, or I'd known them from the area. But I don't know how many people were in that church. But so many people who cared so deeply about Roy, and just I don't know. It was such a strange moment to hear my words being read out. I felt really privileged. I felt touched. But I also felt like I was sharing something really tender and deep with all these people, and we were all connected in that moment through the death of our friend. And then I haven't really dealt with death a lot personally. My grandparents all died when I was quite young, and my parents are still very much alive, and they seem to be very healthy. My father likes to tell me every time I speak to him how many years he has left. He's calculated it. And he, at one point, said he had 10 years left. And now every single time I speak to him, he will update me on how many years and sometimes months he has left. But my parents are very much here. And so Roy's death was really quite an education for me. And I think one of the things I kind of had to come to terms with is I kind of have this approach to life that everything's negotiable. It doesn't matter how far things go. You can always claw it back. You can always go back into a situation. You can always give someone a call that you haven't spoken to for a long time. You can always reprise something. You can always go for a new job. Whatever it is, there's always going to be a good result. I've just kind of got that thing. You can. It's not so much a positive thing. It's more a slightly naive thing, I think. I just always think a situation can be sorted. And then Roy's gone. And he's gone. And I'm not going to call him again, and I'm not going to sit and watch University Challenge with him again, and I'm not going to sit in a pub and have a rowed debate with him again. None of that is ever going to happen. He's gone. He's gone forever, and there will never be a moment in my life where I will see him again. And the permanence of it really struck me at that moment, that this is That's why this is so big. This isn't negotiable. You can't talk your way out of death. Every one of us is on a ticking clock. Every one of us is going to die. For some reason, that's always been very present for me. I often think, I want to get more out today because I've only got so many days left. Or if I have a boring day or a day where I've been required to do something I didn't enjoy, I get really resentful because I think I've only got so many days here to live. So those things came up for me while you were speaking. I think I'd like to talk about the marking of death.
Sure.
How do we, just as a way in, there's so much to talk about here, but how
sure.
do we mark death? How do we celebrate it? How do we mourn it? How do we allow our grief to be processed through ritual process, shared community stuff? What's been your experience of that shared bit? I know you spoke about coming back to Embercombe and how good it was to be able to share. How was, if you don't mind talking about it, how was the funeral for you?
Gosh, the funeral was good. There was a high attendance. I made sure that I invited friends who, really close friends to the funeral who didn't actually know my mum. I think one of them might have met my mum on one occasion. So it's really important that I, if you like, had my people there. So that was quite conscious, I think, Alexander. And then I was really aware that I would be reading the eulogy and, gosh, it's such a good question. How was the funeral for me? So if I really contemplate that and think about it, it was good. I felt like I really connected with it. I really honoured my mum and I marked her life and her passing. I took quite a lot of pride and pleasure and care and craft in writing the eulogy. I tried to make it really very personal. So there was a lot, I kind of smile now. There was a lot about village cricket, about being the cricket tea lady, and there was a lot about riding pillion with my dad on his motorbike and going on holiday, lots about holidays to Torquay and things like that. So really, really getting a strong sense of her. And also, very interestingly, this just pops into my mind. When my mum, before my eldest brother was born, my mum gave birth to a child called Mark, who only survived for about 5 days. And he had some congenital abnormalities, which meant that he just wouldn't survive. And that would have been back in about 1961, 62. And I took the opportunity at the funeral to mention his death as well, because personally, I felt that I wanted to mark his death as well. And I wanted to mark his death for my mum and dad, actually, as well as for me, because I've long had this sort of thought that, back in those times, early 60s, a young couple just married, wanting to start a family, and then that happens. And back then there simply wouldn't have been the sort of, the on-hand counselling services. There wouldn't have been the same kind of psychological kind of care that we expect with those kinds of events these days. So it was really good. I felt like, coming back to what Francis Weller talked about in the bit that I read out, he talked, I think, about honouring death, So for me, and you're talking about rituals, and I think it's terribly important. So just to kind of zoom out a little bit and just make a kind of cultural comment, if you like, my belief is that, we live lives which are devoid of, a lot of ritual and ceremony that we used to be able to rely on. There are other cultures, maybe more, we pejoratively call them primitive, but actually they're probably a lot more savvy in many ways than the culture I find myself living in right now. But anyway, these so-called primitive cultures who would really, take a lot of time in marking death and be really mindful around it. Everyone in the community would be invited to a funeral or to the marking of someone's passing. It would be kind of,
or indeed the preparing for people's passing.
Yeah,
that was always a thing in Indigenous cultures. Is the last days of somebody's life.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So as you're saying, more of a kind of holistic, dare I say, kind of wrap around kind of approach to death and dying in the days before and the days after. Um, and with my mum's funeral, I felt that, right, okay, even though I might live in a culture which might not have the sort of rituals and ceremonies that I might like, I'm going to make the best use of the rituals and ceremonies that are on offer. So going to see the body lying in rest, the whole funeral, and even Embakum, if I'm honest with you, I was provided with a community container, if you like, a speaking circle where I could bring my emotions. So I'm a very strong advocate of. I mean, it's such an interesting point you've raised here, because it's not just about the kind of overt, gross, public scene rituals. For me, it's also about the kind of little private, intimate, insular rituals that I think we can make manifest every single day in relation to what you talked about in your introduction, in relation to these things called metaphorical deaths. So, like the things that come and go on a regular daily basis. I'll just one last thing I'll say before you speak again, Alexander. A little tiny anecdote, but for me this has really resonated, and really means something. So we'll see where it goes. About a year ago, I went outside in the morning and I found a dead bird on my patio. And it didn't have any feathers, so it was almost quite embryonic looking. And I thought, where on earth has this come from? Because it was lying on the ground. There were no kind of overhanging trees. It wasn't in a space where there was a mature tree in our garden. And I thought, well, what's gone on here? And I kind of looked at this dead bird, and I took a photograph of it on my mobile phone, as is the modern way. We kind of human beings that kind of snap away at every available opportunity. I've become one of those human beings. And you know what? I popped it onto Facebook, and thinking now about, well, I wondered if I was sort of breaching some kind of taboo. Is this the sort of thing that people post on Facebook? For me personally, I was just really interested and fascinated. And as I saw this dead bird, I thought, oh, okay, what's happened here? What has been the life of this bird like so far? What are its parents doing? Do birds have feelings? Do they know that this offspring, this young one, this daughter or this son has gone? And I just kind of sat there or stood there rather, and just contemplated all of this. And I popped it out on Facebook, and you know what? It felt a bit strange to do so. But I actually kind of felt like, I mean, you know me, there's a bit of a narky side of me, which can be a bit provocative. And I thought, well, I'm going to post this. This isn't your regular sort of Facebook kind of cheery stuff, look at what I'm doing sort of thing. I'm being a bit facetious there, but for me, there's some truth in that as well. I'm going to interject with something here, which is kind of real life. Not that other stuff isn't real life, but it's a different kind of real life. Is death, is mortality, is something that's come to an end. And I say that because it provided me an opportunity to be faced with death on a day-to-day basis, and to stop and to contemplate and be mindful. And for me, it felt really good, to think about the life of this bird and its parents. So again, coming back to this notion that Francis Wellett, it is grief that moves us in the direction of contact. And from Terry Tempest Williams, grief dares us to love once more. And, it wasn't a kind of sad occasion for me. There was some mourning, but more reflection. And I was curious. You talk about curiosity a lot in your book, Deep Joy, don't you? As it being one of your key orientating principles in your life and what you do and how you go about your days. And for me, I see no reason why I can't bring that quality of kind of curiosity and interest to death, to the passing of things. So I'm trying to turn it into an ornithological podcast. But anyway, that's my second bird bit for today.
Yeah, I mean, what comes up for me there is just I have this ongoing, I think, lifelong frustration with how divorced from the real most of us are most of the time, and how our culture loves it when we do. If we can be not present, not feeling, not truly alive, then that's good. We're controllable, we're safe, we're just rehearsing the same conversations with one another over and over again. We're doing nice, comfortable, safe stuff. And it's absolutely something that I fight against every possible way that I can. And the moments where I connect with a coaching client, or indeed with a friend, in the most tender and deep and intimate and meaningful way, the moments where you feel you've stepped away from just the day-to-day, the regular, the kinds of conversations you have all the time, and suddenly my heart and my gut are in here right now. They're in this conversation. I can feel you. I feel your heart. I am with you in the deepest possible way that human beings can be one with one another. There are only a few things that do that between people. And it's constantly fighting against the culture which just says, be numb, be comfortable, be safe, be normal. And when death comes up, it's one of those moments where everything just kind of drops. If you just drop the topic of death into a conversation, I do it in coaching sessions sometimes. I'll talk about if my client and I have become really clear about an old pattern of behavior or a habit which has always tripped them up, which has always been a problem, which has caused them to have toxic relationships, which has caused them to sabotage their work, which has caused them to just not enjoy their lives in all of the ways they want to, but they keep doing this thing over and over again. We'll identify where it's coming from and we'll give it some kind of context. And then I will say, let's allow this to die. Let's talk about where this has come from. Let's give it a decent eulogy, a funeral. Let's ceremonize this. Let's give it some marking. And then let's allow that to die in us. When you begin using that kind of language, everything drops. It stops feeling light and heady and safe, and it starts feeling in the tummy, uncertain, weird, unfamiliar, but also real. And it's that place that I love to live. And it comes back to that quote you opened out with, that it is grief and it is impermanence and it is the imminence of losing. And then the reality of losing forever, something which has been so precious to us, that makes everything worthwhile, makes everything real and have meaning and purpose. Without that, we're just kind of living in our heads and we're just kind of rehearsing stuff and we're just kind of going through, bimbling along. And I at the heart of my work and at the heart of my personal calling in life, it's about living while we're alive. It's about being here and just grabbing hold of this life thing and saturating ourselves in it. The good, the so-called good and the so-called bad, all the experience, all the sensation. And there are a few things. There's things like vulnerability. There is love in its truest sense. There is, I think, rage in sense of raging against injustice, and grief are some of those things that call us back to one another, call us into the moment, call us into the realness of what we're experiencing, drop us below the mundane and the humdrum and the rehearsing and the kinds of things that honestly we kick ourselves for when we approach our death. I just want to, actually on that topic, I just want to quickly pull in some work from Steven Jenkinson. I have talked about him before, but Steven Jenkinson is a Canadian psychotherapist. He's a very eccentric old man now. I've seen him give public talks a number of times. I've actually eaten pizza with the guy as well. And he talks about death a lot. He used to be called, in the press in North America, in America and in Canada where he worked, he was known as the Angel of Death. That was the epitaph, that was the title that he was given. And he worked with people who were dying, and he's worked with hundreds, I think thousands of people as they approach their own death. And he's just sort of learnt some core, really important stuff about that time. And here I'm referencing his book, Die Wise, particularly, but there's some stuff of his on YouTube, and he has other works. And a few of the things he says are things like, we shouldn't approach death as a rookie, as most of us do. Death is often so traumatic for people, and it can be a deeply traumatic experience because we're not ready. We've never thought about it. We never really thought it would happen to me. We thought it would happen to you. We thought it would happen in theory. We thought, we know in theory that it's going to happen, but suddenly it becomes real and personal, and then death is there, and there's no escaping it. There's no avoiding it. We're going to end. And society doesn't like it. No one wants to know. There's often a sense of triumph if you can carry on anyway, carry on regardless. He tells anecdotes of being called to go and work with someone, and he'd turn up at their house to speak to them. He knew that they had had a diagnosis. He knew that they had weeks to live. Got into the house, and the house is immaculate, and the person is doing the washing up, and they speak very proudly about the fact they're not letting this change their lives. They're carrying on. And just kind of a fascination with that. Why would we do that to ourselves? I mean, we are dying. But there's so much pressure from our families and from our culture and from our friends to just, can you not be dying, please? Let's just pretend you're not dying, and then you'll be gone, and then we can go to a funeral, have a bit of a cry, and then get on with our lives again. We don't want to be interfered with. We don't want to be pulled out of our nice, numb bubble and reminded that there is so much more to life, and that our own mortality exists, and that we're losing you forever. So can you just carry on? And then that kind of social pressure gets internalized, and then it's this sense of, yes, I've done really well. I haven't let death beat me. But it is going to win, guys. Death is going to win. You're at some point going to draw your last breath. And if you don't do preparatory work, according to Steven Jenkinson, that is going to be deeply traumatic. It's going to be terrifying. It's going to be lonely. Even if you're surrounded by people, you're the only person who's dying at that moment. So you are going to be lying there, and you are going to be transfixed with terror. And what an awful way to be ending. And you may even, in your last moments, need to pretend to those in the room that you're okay about it. And your last moments may be putting on the final mask of everything's fine, even as you are deeply traumatized. So he just encourages us not to be rookies, to experience death. When I opened this podcast, I talked about different interpretations of death and dying, and he would just be like, grab it all, be with it all. When Neil posts the picture of the dead bird on Facebook, engage with that. Let it touch you. Let it drop you down into your gut. He also, Steven Jenkinson, likes to poo-poo this phrase that there are living people and dying people. Once you've had a diagnosis and you've only got a little while to live, you're dying. Everyone else is living. Nope. We're all dying. We're all one category of people, and we are all the category of dying people. I am dying right now. You listening to this podcast, you are dying right now. Neil, you've got a smile on your face, but I'm afraid, mate, you're dying right now.
But the trick is, you see, I can die and also have a smile on my face.
Nice. How do you do that?
Well, I'm smiling because there's so much in what you say. And like you say, Alexander, this may be a topic that we revisit in future episodes. A couple of things I really want to respond to. What you said about referencing Steven Jenkinson's work about preparing for death and what that might look like and how we might do that. Because I'm very aware that one of the reasons me and you do this podcast is to now death isn't something you can fix, so it's not something you can kind of give pointers to. It's going to happen. But for me, there's something about what me and you do on this podcast in terms of making offerings, in terms of how we might approach things, how we might understand things, how we might do things differently, how we might change in some way. So I'd like to speak a little bit to what you talk about preparing for death. And then also I'd like to speak a little bit to what you're saying about metaphorical deaths. And I think they combine into the same response, actually, as I think about it. So I think for me, the preparation is nothing more complicated than being with the passing of things on a daily basis, being with the coming, existing and going of things. I tend to look quite simplistically on this in terms of everything has a beginning, a middle and an end. And in our culture, we're really into beginnings, into getting something going, planning a project, all the excitement around that. And then generally as a culture, we love the middle bit, we love the doing bit, we love the creating things, making things manifest, bringing into being something that wasn't there before. But when it comes to endings, whether it's clearing up after a party or having to write the final accounts or to write the final report, to me, it seems like kind of we don't like to do that bit. And for me, that's kind of emblematic of this pervasive death denial or this ending denial. So for my invitation really to anybody who's listening is to take every opportunity to take some mindful moments when absolutely anything passes. Because everything passes. It's not that anything passes. Absolutely everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So the invitation is to, whether it's saying cheerio to a friend after seeing them for a day's walk, or whether it's the actual physical death of someone, or whether it's the passing of a season, or whatever it is, get interested and see if you can be with the process of mourning and what comes up for you. There might, what reflections come up? What happens to your heart when you consciously be with something which is passing? There may be tears, there may be sadness, but as I've alluded to, spoken quite overtly to actually, there can be an opening of the heart. So, and then we can much more easily and readily be with death and dying and passing. So the preparation that you speak of in relation to what Steven Jenkinson talks about, for me, is that daily being with and talking with people about this stuff. Last thing I'll say is, when you were talking, I just wrote down the word relief and underlined it, and how I experienced, right, okay, I can talk about this stuff. I can de-tabooize it. And then what opens up for me in relation to an interaction with another person is a completely new vista. I've entered a completely new territory, like you talked about with your clients, being in a very different space. So something about the relief and the permission given and the opening upness of being able to talk about death and dying and passing and ending. Yeah, that's my last piece. Over to you, Alexander.
Yeah, thank you. So I just want to end with an interesting extra point that Steven Jenkinson brings up towards the end of his book, Die Wise. Die Wise is an enormous book, and he does have this habit of covering the same ground over and over again, but he's a theologian by training, like I am, and there's just this temptation to just do a systematic assassination of various ideas. And where death is such a big topic for our culture, he has a lot of legwork to do. He has a lot of ground to cover. But towards the end, he touches on something which most of us would never really think of around death. And it's one of those surprising, unexpected topics that only those who have had a lot of experience of death would notice. It took him a long time to notice in his career. And I just want to touch on it because it'll bring us full circle back to our general topic, but it also might be a launch pad for a future episode. So he begins this by talking about an anecdote where he's running a support group for a group of men who have all been diagnosed with a certain kind of cancer. They're all facing their imminent death. They're all in a room. Guys are doing their usual self-defensive, Western, compartmentalized, masculine thing. And then one of the men says, words to the effect of, "I don't know where I come from." And when he finishes saying those words, every man in the room begins to cry. And while in that moment, I'm sure that Stephen was just supporting these guys, I think it kind of clocked something in his mind. And he just thought, there's a deeper story here. And he began researching that and exploring it. And what he kind of came to the conclusion of is that a lot of the trauma at the end of life comes from regrets of things that we didn't do and opportunities we didn't take and masks we wore that prevented us from being our true selves. That's an aspect. There is the total inexperience of death and the not allowing of death. And so death becomes this deeply lonely, very laden with shame experience. But even below that, I've talked about how death is something that calls us into the moment, into our bodies, into our guts. Suddenly everything becomes more real and a bit more, okay, this is actually happening. But even below that, there is this idea that death reminds us of our relationship, of where we come from, our belonging, our sense of identity in connection with something older, with something ancient, that we are part of something that will endure. For those of us who have children, there is some kind of continuity there. For those of us who seek fame and notoriety, perhaps there'll be some kind of immortality there. But deeper than that, and for all of us, there is this idea that if you are connected with the land, and if you are, you know the place that you come from, you know the people that you come from, the tradition, the ways that ancestors are revered or remembered or treated, that it's the final piece, it's the final soothing, it's the final completion which allows death to be okay, which allows us to meet our death, to meet a good death, as you were saying earlier, Neil. That if we belong and we know who we are and where we come from and where we're connected, and that we will be remembered, and that we remember those who have come before us, then that is the psychological piece that the human being needs in order to meet death in a whole way. And who can say that now? Who knows where they come from? Who knows who their people are? Who knows what their traditions are? Who knows that they will be honoured and that they have honoured those who came before? It's almost universally missing, I would suggest. So I just wanted to mention that as another thing that Stephen talks about, because it's another deeper stepping off point into a conversation or a reflection or some ideas. And it brings us back to this idea of big yearnings, deep longings, a sense of craving belonging and identity and place, and to know who and what and part of what we are. I just wanted to finish with that.
Thank you, Alexander. That was lovely. I was really affected by what you just said there, the whole thing about belonging. And I know we've touched on that in the past, haven't we, in previous episodes? But I think you really speak a lot of truth there. I certainly chime with that in terms of the importance of where do we come from. It's almost like we need to know where we've come from in order to know where we're going, where we fit in the whole kind of matrix that is life and death, both of those sides. And I'm aware we've touched on belonging in previous podcast episodes, and that as you were talking, thoughts, ideas, contemplations are already coming up in my mind around, okay, what does belonging mean to me? How do I anchor myself in that notion? What can I do? How can I be in a culture where that, as you say, and I agree, that sense of belonging, rootedness, earthness, call it what you will, is missing for many, many, many of us. So yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today. I will actually mention our topic for next time now, and this has happened somewhat by accident, but it seems to marry up really well. Our topic for next time is actually belonging. In a fortnight, we will be back talking about belonging. So that follows on really well from today's episode, and perhaps that's a way for us to touch on some of this stuff again. If there's been stuff about death and dying that we brought up today that you'd like to hear more of, if there's a whole section that you would like to hear us touch on that we didn't speak about today, then please do get in touch. We really do thrive off your feedback when we get emails or comments on social media, as we do regularly, saying how much you've enjoyed certain things, that there's certain things you'd like us to talk about differently, or new topics you'd like us to cover. It's just wonderful. We'll forward each other emails that we've received from someone saying, listen to the podcast, loving it, really loving how you talked about this. Could you talk about this next? And it's great. It puts a smile on both of our faces. So yeah, we would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining us today, and please do spread the word of the podcast. If you think this could be useful to anyone else, if there's a topic we've touched on that you think could really help somebody or be useful to someone, then do send them a link to that episode. We're on all the platforms. We're on Spotify. We're on iTunes. You can also get to us on our website or through social media. There's lots of ways to listen to the podcast, so please do spread the word. If you'd like to get in touch with us personally, if you want to drop me a message or if you want to drop Neil a message, then there's different ways to do that. Neil, if someone wants to get in touch with you, how do they do it?
The best way, Alexander, is through my website, www.coachingforlifefroome.co.uk, and my contact details are there in terms of phone and email.
Great. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can go onto my website, which is deepcoaching.co.uk. And you can either book a consultation call with me, or if you go to that same page, there's a little message to just drop me an email, and I would love to hear from you. So that's everything from us today. Thank you so much for being with us. We'll be back in a fortnight with a big conversation about belonging. Until then, take care of everybody, and goodbye.
Yes, goodbye from me. Look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.